Let's bring in former Florida senior judge Phyllis Cote. And Judge, again, let me just outline the 4 pieces of testimony the jury wants to hear again. It's David Pecker on that June 2016 call with Trump, Pecker on buying Karen McDougal's life rights, Pecker and Michael Cohen's accounts of that 2015 Trump Tower meeting where they hatched the plan to catch and kill stories that could be harmful to Trump's campaign. What do these requests from the jury tell you?
It really does tell you where and the kinds of things that the jury is focusing on in terms of looking for corroboration, looking at testimony that they might question for some reason in terms of the credibility of a witness, but seeing or analyzing whether there is or are pieces of evidence that coincide. So I think you get to see that when you hear their selection of what they want to hear and the judge actually giving them that information.
And again, these jury instructions are lengthy. It took the judge over an hour to read them initially. The jury requesting a chunk in the middle of these instructions to hear again. I imagine you have heard hundreds of cases in your court, maybe thousands, I don't know. How complicated is this one for the jury?
Well, it can be complicated, first of all, because you're dealing with a number of counts or charges. But the easy thing about that, though, is a lot of the charges are duplications, or so that once the jury is able to make a decision as to one of those charges or as to one of those issues, it then can be easily applied to others. So that certainly makes it a little easier to understand. But one of the things that's happening, and we see it being played out in terms of the types of questions that are being asked, is what is the proper inference to be given to the testimony and evidence of any given witness, and then what happens as it relates to the defendant. And as we've heard from the instructions given by the judge, there'll be a set of instructions about the inference that can be drawn from Mr. Pecker's testimony, from Mr. Cohen's testimony, but alongside that is this instruction that this must not or should not be applied to the defendant. So it becomes very important. Instructions and jury instructions are key elements of this portion of the trial. It's actually one of the most successfully appealable areas in terms of any errors that can occur.
And do you see any potential vulnerabilities in these instructions that could be brought up on appeal?
Was that to me?
Yes.
Now, actually, this judge has been excellent with how he's handled questions, with how he's handled the presentation or receipt of evidence, and how he's handled this jury. So I take my hat off to him. He's done an incredible job with representing the judiciary as fair, neutral, detached, and properly engaged in seeking justice.
Meantime, right now inside the courtroom, they're talking about the Federal Election Campaign Act, page 31 of the jury instructions. Meantime, Trump's been raging on social media nonstop throughout the trial. He had something like 20 posts within an hour of the jury beginning their deliberations yesterday. In one of these posts yesterday, he seemed to refer to Michael Cohen. Judge, he said, quote, "There is no crime except for the bum that got caught stealing from me." That would appear to be a violation of the gag order, no? And although prosecutors, I should say, haven't brought it up, at this point, is it even worth the court addressing further violations, or could it come back to bite Trump perhaps in sentencing if he's convicted?
Well, you know, one of the things we talk about a lot of times is whether the judge should act sua sponte, on his own, on her own, in terms of determining whether certain issues should be addressed. And we saw that earlier with how the judge dealt with the objections during the testimony of one of the witnesses and finally objecting to it or restricting that testimony and evidence. And I think we see the same kind of thing with the possible violation of a gag order. First of all, the prosecution did not file a motion asking that the judge should consider this. And given where we are in this trial and the end being in sight, as a judge, you really do not want to get bogged down with collateral issues that really don't relate to guilt or innocence. So it may be a violation, but it also may be an intentional decision of the judge that if no one brings this up and I don't have to deal with it, I'm not going to deal with this.
Over and over and over again, Trump has called Judge Merchan conflicted. He's called him corrupt. He's also attacked other judges in his other cases. He's called the judicial system rigged in speeches outside the court, online. It's this message he just keeps hammering home. And voters, Judge Cote, seem to be internalizing this message. Take a look at this.
It seems like a witch hunt to me.
It's my personal opinion that a lot of this stuff is vindictive.
Banana Republic tactics of persecution when they could have brought those charges against him many years ago.
They're echoing what they're hearing from Trump. How worried are you about the impacts this case could have on public sentiment toward our judiciary and democracy, regardless of the outcome?
Actually, I'm very worried because one of the things that we hear happening over and over again is references that are clearly inapplicable. For example, we are in a state court. So whether a federal court decided to bring charges or decided not to bring charges really isn't relevant. And if you look at this test, look at the facts in a way that really kind of detaches itself from the political, they have nothing to do with each other. One of the things that hopefully Judge Merchan's behavior has really cemented is the fact that he is so transparent about what he does, that he does try, it appears to be a fair and neutral magistrate. But there is some concern that people will not accept the conclusion, would not accept the verdict if they question the legitimacy of the decision maker and the decision making process. So I think it is an issue of great concern. I think it's an issue that has fairly been dealt with in terms of our system, but one that we cannot ignore because many people look at what one person calls a fact and comes up with a totally different conclusion. And that's a concern here, these alternate facts that we're dealing with.